All right. I want to welcome everybody to once again to today's Zoomtime Knowledge presentation. As I mentioned, for those of you that joined the meeting earlier, this is a free public lecture series hosted by the James Madison University Lifelong Learning Institute. It's supported through the voluntary donations of members like you who are connected today and some who are watching by live stream. As Sue mentioned, we'll be recording today's session. You should have gotten a notification on your screen to consent to that recording. This video will be available later through for on-demand viewing on our website at www.jmu.edu/LLI. I have the pleasure today of welcoming John Noffsinger, who will be our featured presenter. And John is volunteering his time today. So John, thank you for being with us and for sharing your knowledge as part of this series. John is also an advisory board member with the Lifelong Learning Institute. He earned a Ph.D. in English from the University of Virginia and specialized in the 19th century English novel. For 38 years, John has had taught literature and writing in the Virginia independent school system. John, I'm going to start your presentation. I'll stop my video. And once that's up, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Rodney and Sue especially, and especially for their tech support this week. I didn't realize until recently how much time it took for them to arrange these video conferences. So I'm very grateful for them for the time they put in. I'd also like to thank LLI, of course, just for the opportunity of getting together and gathering us together for this meeting. I'd like to say a word about Zoom. It was a technology that until 6 weeks ago, I think I'd never even heard of. And then now it seems inescapable. It's obviously used for educational ventures now. Our 5- and 7-year-old grandsons are studying in kindergarten and second grade via Zoom. It's used in high schools, colleges, graduate schools, telemedicine, committee work, family reunions. So Zoom is ubiquitous now. What I was intrigued about was yesterday reading about something that's developed, a phenomenon called Zoom fatigue. I don't know if any of you saw that, but it has to do with the exhaustion that comes about for using Zoom too much, spending too much Zoom time, which essentially means that in 6 weeks, we've gone from Zoom technology to it becoming a pathology, which is kind of interesting trajectory there. I find that the cure for me is to go into this stream you see behind me. So I'm actually standing knee deep in this water as I speak, and that's very refreshing. I see some of you also have other Zoom fatigue cures, like going to San Francisco and places like that. So whatever works for you is fine. Another thing I'd like to comment on is Dickens and April. I think that's kind of interesting because Dickens is one of those authors who are neglected for 11 months of the year, and then around the 1st of December, we're confronted with Ebenezer Scrooge and Tiny Tim and Bob Cratchit and the Fezziwigs and Ghosts of Christmas Past and all kinds of Dickens characters are in our path in December. But one of the things I hope comes out of today's meeting is just a appreciation for Dickens that extends beyond December. And then finally, one other reason, perhaps you're here, I don't know, but if you're like Mary and me, you find that your calendar is a little more empty than it used to be with no social obligations, doctor's appointments, and things like that. It's a good time to read long novels, and Dickens wrote long novels. So yeah, it's a good time to get into Dickens if you so choose. So welcome, and again, I thank Rodney for the invitation to to be here. I'm going to turn over the slideshow presentation to Rodney. We were doing a tech check yesterday and it turned out that this worked much better. So if you can see this slide up, that's what we're about today. Charles Dickens and women. We're going to look at larger portraits than these thumbnails that you have in front of you, but that's a wonderful jaunty photograph of Dickens on the right. And that's what we'll be exploring. So Rodney, can we have the next slide, please? Here's the plan for the day. First, I'd like to give quite a bit of background on Dickens' early life because it was so influential in his writing. And then we'll look at 5 women in his life and the way they influenced his writing and his works. Elizabeth Dickens, his mother, Maria Beadnell, the young woman he fell desperately in love with when he was a late teenager. Catherine Hogarth, the woman he married. Mary Hogarth, one of his wife's younger sisters. And then a woman that I'm going to tantalize you with now by calling her the invisible woman, but she'll become less invisible as we get toward the end of the presentation today. But very interesting relationship that developed toward the end of his life. And then we'll end with some Q&A and conversation, I hope, on Dickens. Questions that you might have that arise as I'm speaking, please send them along, as Rodney said. I actually prefer Q and R to Q&A, a question and response rather than question and answer, because I might not have answers to your questions. In fact, it's likely I won't be able to answer all your questions, but I will try to have a response to your questions. Today, I'd like to share with you some thoughts about Charles Dickens and the women in his life. Specifically, I plan to address his relationships with his mother, his first love, his wife, his sister-in-law, and his mistress. All of these women exerted a significant influence on Dickens' development as a man and an artist. I'll present some of the facts of Dickens' life and examine how his interactions with these women tended to appear, albeit in transformed ways, in his novels. But first, I'd like to start with a 2-word summary of Dickens' relationship with women. It's complicated. Everything else I say today will be an elaboration of these 2 words. Rodney, can we have the next slide, please? Charles Dickens was born on the 7th of February, 1812, into a lower middle-class family. His father, John, was a clerk in a Navy pay office. Charles's mother, Elizabeth, taught him how to read and gave him his first Latin lessons. Up to a point, we can sum up Dickens' childhood as a series of moves to progressively poorer houses. His family moved to London when Charles was 2. Rodney, next slide, please. To Kent when he was 5, and back to London when he was 10. This would have been in 1822. Because of his father's extravagance, his tendency to constantly live above his means, the family's financial situation became increasingly desperate. And it wasn't just Dickens' father who was to blame for these dire economic circumstances. At one point, Dickens' mother tried to establish a school, and while she spent money on advertising and other expenses, no students enrolled. This failure provided the tipping point for ruinous family finances in the Dickens household. In later life, Dickens held his mother responsible for what he called the blind optimism that led to this financial crisis in the family. Next slide, please. With the family in crisis mode, young Charles was offered a job at Warren's Blacking Warehouse in London, a factory that made boot polish. Later, Dickens said that his parents took up this offer very willingly. So in 1824, 2 days after Charles's 12th birthday, he began work at Warren's Blacking, pasting labels on blacking bottles. With considerable bitterness, Dickens later remarked that his parents could not have been more satisfied if I had been 20 years of age, distinguished at grammar school, and going to Cambridge. This experience at Warren's was the central traumatic episode of Charles Dickens' life. Next slide, please. Later that month, on the 20th of February, John Dickens was arrested for debt and sent to the Marshalsea prison a setting that is of central importance to Dickens' novel, Little Dorrit. I have here a picture. The Marshalsea was actually torn down in the late 19th century. So there's a picture on the left, and on the right is a picture of the wall, the south wall of the Marshalsea, which still stands in London. And in 2005, I spent some time in London, was able to do some pilgrimages to some of the sites associated with Dickens, and went to where the Marshalsea prison used to be. But on the site of the Marshalsea prison, right behind this wall, is now a public library. So I went into the public library and took a copy of Little Dorrit off the shelf and read a little bit there, right on the scene. On the 28th of May, again, this is 1824, when Charles was 12 years old. On the 28th of May, owing to a timely legacy of £450 from his mother, who had died in April, John Dickens was released from prison and resumed his work with the Navy Pay Office. But for a time, Charles remained at Warren's Blacking. Elizabeth, his mother, was all in favor of Charles continuing to work at Warren's, though his father remained firmly against this. Dickens never forgave his mother for her willingness to let him stay on at Warren's Blacking. The shame of this episode was acute, not only to Charles, but also to his parents, who never again spoke of this period in their lives. I'd like to pause for a moment and look at this episode. The shock of going to work at Warren's blacking factory was almost worse than the hardship of work itself, for Dickens found the loneliness hard to bear. One of the most interesting psychological aspects about this part of his life is that Dickens never revealed this experience to anyone except John Forster. Ronnie, can you show the next slide, please? His closest friend. He never told his wife or family. Around 1843, about 20 years after his time at Warren's, Dickens began writing what has come to be known as the autobiographical fragment, which was first published in Forster's biography of Dickens in 1872, 2 years after Dickens' death. The autobiographical fragment provides a fascinating glimpse into Dickens' state of mind, that is, into the way he as an adult looked back on it and evaluated that part of his life when he was 12. Here are some excerpts from the autobiographical fragment. Rodney, could you? Okay, so the shadow of Dickens' mother is behind a lot of this. It is wonderful to me, and by wonderful he means here it's a matter of wonder and incomprehension, not wonderful in the positive connotation. It is wonderful to me how I could have been so easily cast away at such an age. No one had compassion enough on me, a child of singular abilities, quick, eager, delicate, and soon hurt, bodily or mentally, to suggest that something might have been spared, as certainly it might have been, to place me at any common school. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sank into this companionship at Warren's, compared these everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, and felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast. The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was to my young heart to believe that day by day, what I had learned and thought and delighted in was passing away from me, never to be brought back anymore, cannot be written. My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often wander desolately back to that time in my life. I had no advice, no counsel, no encouragement, no consolation, no support from anyone I can call to mind, so help me God. How much I suffered, it is utterly beyond my power to tell. I do not write resentfully or angrily, for I know how all these things have worked together to make me what I am, but I never afterwards forgot, I never shall forget, I never can forget that my mother was warm from my being sent back to Warren's. From that hour until this at which I write, no word of that part of my childhood which I have now gladly brought to a close has passed my lips to any human being. I have never, until I now impart it to this paper, in any burst of confidence with anyone, my own wife not excepted, raised the curtain I then dropped. So remember, this information about this reminiscence of Warren's blacking was not known until 2 years after Dickens' death. Some of the images that emerged from Dickens' time at Warren's blacking have come down to us in iconic ways. Primary among these images is that of the abandoned and lonely child being thrust into an adult world. Rodney, could you advance the slideshow, please? Thank you. The abandoned and lonely child being thrust into an adult world beyond his control or comprehension. Childhood, for Dickens, becomes a symbol of innocence and vulnerability. And we might think here of Oliver Twist, of Little Nell from the Old Curiosity Shop. Next slide, please. A few more familiar characters, Tiny Tim, David Copperfield. Dickens suggests that our essential self is formed in childhood, and in later life we need to remain in contact with the sensitive and vulnerable self that is at the core of our being. You might remember that the ghost of Christmas past serves this function for Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. In the first pages of that wonderful novella, we meet a Scrooge who is so alienated from his childhood that we can't even imagine his ever having been a child. But with the supernatural intervention of the ghost of Christmas past, who has come to provide the first stage of Scrooge's reclamation, Scrooge revisits his former self, presented as a solitary child, quite neglected by his friends. The image is both sad and tender, and Scrooge's reaction to this reconnection to his childhood is to weep. Another consequence that emerges from his experience at Warren's blacking is Dickens' bitterness towards his mother, a relationship dramatized in his fiction as a history of bad mothers and fathers. Next slide, please. In fact, one of the leitmotifs of Dickens' fiction becomes the absent mother or father, symbolized in part by an astonishing number of children who are orphans. We have Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Little Nell from the Old Curiosity Shop, Esther Summerson in Bleak House, Pip in Great Expectations. It becomes almost impossible for Dickens to conceive of a happy domestic relationship. In her old age, Elizabeth Dickens became senile, and Dickens refers to her rather unkindly as a ghastly absurdity. With equal amounts of affection and asperity, Dickens transforms her into Mrs. Nickleby in Nicholas Nickleby, about whom the narrator says, she had at no time been remarkable for the possession of a very clear understanding. In 1812, the same year Dickens left Warren's blacking, he began school at Wellington House Academy. In 1827, at the age of 15, he left school when in a deja vu moment, the family was evicted from lodgings for non-payment of rent and became an office boy at an attorney's office. He also began to teach himself shorthand. In 1828, he became a freelance shorthand reporter, and eventually in 1832, at the age of 20, a shorthand reporter for the Mirror of Parliament, a transcript of parliamentary proceedings. Could you show the next slide, please? Thank you. In 1829, at the age of 17, he fell desperately in love with Maria Beadnell and loved her to the point of infatuation for the next 4 years. Maria was a year older than Dickens and was by all objective accounts flirtatious, capricious, and silly. Her displays of affection would alternate with pouts and sulks. But as is sometimes typical at that young age, Dickens' infatuation became a passion, the obsession of unrequited love. Later, he recalled that he first saw her in a sort of raspberry-colored dress, and my boyish heart was pinned like a captured butterfly. Eventually, he wrote long letters to Maria's mother, all unsent, declaring his love for her adorable daughter. But the Beadnells were unhappy with Dickens as a suitor, for at this time, he was, after all, merely a shorthand reporter. In the winter of 1831-32, Maria was sent to France by her father, ostensibly to finish her education, but perhaps also to separate her from Dickens. Even though he had been tormented by her vivacious teasing, Charles was desolate. Finally, in 1833, on his 21st birthday, he declared his love for her, and she dismissed him as a boy. At that point, Dickens became aggressively self-pitying and found it hard to accept that Maria had grown tired of him. To some extent, this relationship was recreated through David and Dora Copperfield in Dickens' most autobiographical novel, the book that tellingly picked up where the autobiographical fragment left off. Let's now fast forward more than 20 years. Maria had passed out of Dickens' life and, like Charles, had married. She was now Mrs. Winter. Then in February of 1855, he received a letter from her. She was 44 years old and the mother of 2 daughters. And at this point, Dickens was the most famous author in the English-speaking world, but unhappy in his marriage. By the way, there'll be much more on that later. Without meeting Maria, Dickens began a flow of romantic fantasies. He wrote her letters, nostalgically reminiscing back to the time he had adored her. In response to her letter of February 1855, he wrote back, 3 or 4 and 20 years vanished like a dream, and I opened your letter with the touch of my young friend David Copperfield when he was in love. It is impossible to be spoken to out of the old times without a softened emotion. In a second letter written later that month, we find the following. I have never been so good a man since as I was when you made me wretchedly happy. An interesting oxymoron. He alludes to his memory of their previous relationship, claiming, the most innocent, the most ardent, and the most disinterested days of my life had you for their son. He calls her the angel of my soul and exclaims, you ask me to treasure what you tell me in my heart of hearts. Oh, see what I have cherished there through all this time and all these changes. In one of her letters, she tells Dickens she's toothless, fat, old, and ugly. And he replies, I don't believe it. But alas, he discovered that she wasn't exaggerating. Hoping to recapture some of his original relationship to Maria, Dickens set up a meeting with her without the knowledge of his wife, but the result of this re-encounter was catastrophic. The words shock and disillusionment are among the first that come to mind to characterize their reunion. Dickens had built up this reunion into an enormously important emotional event, and the reality of meeting Maria was crushing. All of Dickens' hopes and expectations were dashed, and he became completely disillusioned. After the meeting, Dickens wrote to Forster, just as I can never open David Copperfield as I open any other book, I cannot see the face even at 4 and 40, or hear the voice without wandering away over the ashes of all that youth and hope in the wildest manner. But with Dickens, no life experience was ever wasted. A few months later, in May of 1855, Dickens began writing Little Dorrit, and he built Maria into this novel in the form of Flora Finching. Can we have the next slide, please? This is an illustration from Little Dorrit. That's Flora Finching on the right, with a wonderful character called Mr. F's aunt on the left. Here is how he transmuted these feelings into Little Dorrit, when after an almost 25-year gap, Arthur Clenham returns to London and meets his first love, Flora Finching. She had been the object of his adoration, but his mother had prevented him from marrying her. Now he meets her again, like Dickens, filled with eagerness, optimism, and ardor, and this is what he discovers. Clenham's eyes no sooner fell upon the object of his old passion than it shivered and broke to pieces. Most men will be found sufficiently true to themselves to be true to an old idea. It is no proof of an inconstant mind, but exactly the opposite, when the idea will not bear close comparison with the reality, and the contrast is a fatal shock to it. Such was Clenham's case. In his youth, he had ardently loved this woman, and had heaped upon her all the locked up wealth of his affection and imagination. Ever since that memorable time, though he had, until the night of his arrival, as completely dismissed her from any association with his present or future as if she had been dead, he had kept the old fancy of the past unchanged in its old sacred place. And now, Flora's father, Mr. Casby, coolly walked into the parlor saying in effect, be good enough to throw it down and dance upon it. This is Flora. Flora, always tall, had grown to be very broad too, and short of breath. But that was not much. Flora, whom he had left a lily, had become a peony, but that was not much. Flora, who had seemed enchanting in all she said and thought, was diffuse and silly. That was much. Flora, who had been spoiled and artless long ago, was determined to be spoiled and artless now. That was a fatal blow. This is Flora. I am sure, giggled Flora, tossing her head with a caricature of her girlish manner, I'm ashamed to see Mr. Clennam. I am a mere fright. I know he'll find me fearfully changed. I'm actually an old woman. It's shocking to be so found out. It's really shocking. He assured her that she was just what he had expected, and the time had not stood still with himself. Oh, but with a gentleman, it's so different, and really you look so amazingly well that you have no right to say anything of the kind, while as to me, you know, oh, cried Flora with a little scream, I am dreadful. But if we talk of not having changed, said Flora, who whatever she said never once came to a full stop, look at Papa. Is not Papa precisely what he was when you went away? Isn't it cruel and unnatural of Papa to be such a reproach to his own child? If we go on in this way much longer, people who don't know us will begin to suppose that I am Papa's mamma. That must be a long time hence, Arthur considered. Oh, Mr. Clennam, you insincerest of creatures, said Flora. I perceive already you have not lost your old way of paying compliments, your old way when you need to pretend to be so sentimentally struck, you know. At least, I don't mean that. Oh, I don't know what I mean. Here Flora uttered confusedly and gave him one of her old glances. You mustn't think of going yet, said Flora. Arthur had looked at his hat, being in a ludicrous dismay and not knowing what to do. You could never be so unkind as to think of going, Arthur. I mean, Mr. Arthur. I suppose Mr. Clennam would be far more proper. But I am sure I don't know what I am saying without a word about the dear old days gone forever. However, when I come to think of it, I dare say it would be much better not to speak of them, and it's highly probable that you have some much more agreeable engagement, and pray let me be the last person in the world to interfere with it, though there was a time, but I am running into nonsense again. Was it possible that Flora could have been such a chatterer in the days she referred to? Could there have been anything like her present disjointed volubility and the fascinations that had captivated him? While the comedic effusion here belongs to Flora, the pain and awareness of a grotesquely altered transmutation of the past belonged to Arthur, and by extension, to Charles Dickens himself. Let's now rewind 20 or so years and turn back to the 1830s. As Dickens was becoming a phenomenal success as a parliamentary reporter, he also began to write sketches of London life and characters published under the pseudonym Boz. He agreed to write more verbal sketches for the Evening Chronicle, edited by George Hogarth, and at Hogarth's he met and fell in love with the publisher's daughter, Catherine. In the spring of 1835, when Dickens was 23, she and Dickens became engaged. Catherine was at times spoiled, sulky, and petulant, but Dickens was now more assertive and dominant than he had been with Maria Beadnell. They married in April of 1836, the same month the first number of the Pickwick Papers was published. After a week's honeymoon, they settled in London. Also living with them was Catherine's 16-year-old sister, Mary Hogarth. Mary was young, innocent, and beautiful, and she gave Dickens an admiration that was both heartfelt and unalloyed. The following year, in April of 1837, Dickens, Catherine, and their baby, Charlie, moved to 48 Doughty Street, and Mary came to stay with them. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. This is 48 Doughty Street. It's actually a Charles Dickens house and museum in London now. Suddenly, the next month, on the 7th of May, 1837, Mary died at the age of 17. Could we have the next slide, please? This is the room in which she died at that house on Doughty Street in London. She died of a previously unknown and unsuspected heart problem. Dickens was overpowered with grief. He took her ring, put it on his finger, and never removed it. He took a lock of her hair and kept it in a locket. He kept her clothes and afterwards often went to look at them moldering away. He was unable to work, and for the first and only time in his professional life, couldn't make deadlines for the Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, both of which were now being published simultaneously. For months after her death, he dreamed of her every night, and he expressed the desire to be buried next to her. In a letter 4 days after Mary's death, he wrote, "Thank God she died in my arms, and the very last words she whispered were of me." Next slide, please. In other letters written shortly after Mary Hogarth's death, he emphasized the intensity of his grief. You cannot conceive the misery in which this dreadful event has plunged us. Since our marriage, she has been the grace and life of our home, the admired of all for her beauty and excellence. I could have better spared a much nearer relation or an older friend, for she has been to us what we can never replace, and has left a blank which no one who ever knew her can have the faintest hope of being supplied. 3 weeks after her death, Dickens wrote to another friend, I have lost the dearest friend I ever had. Words cannot describe the pride I felt in her and the devoted attachment I bore her. She had not a fault. I wish you could know how I miss that pleasant smile and those sweet words, which in our merry banterings around the fire were more precious to me than the applause of the whole world could be. We might have known that we were too happy together. She had not a single fault. Several years after Mary's death, her brother George died and was buried next to her, and Dickens agonized that he couldn't share her grave. He wrote, the desire to be buried next to her is as strong upon me now as it was 5 years ago. And I know, for I don't think there ever was love like that I bear her, that will never diminish. I cannot bear the thought of being excluded from her dust. Dickens even composed his sister-in-law's epitaph. Mary Scott Hogarth died 7th May, 1837, young, beautiful, and good. God in his mercy numbered her with his angels at the early age of 17. The question that suggests itself is, how does the death of Mary Hogarth get transmuted in the crucible of Dickens' imagination? She becomes a womanly ideal. We have hints of her presence in almost every novel after her death. Young, virginal, devoted, and ethereal girls, incarnations of purity, but also vapid and one-dimensional. Rose Maylie, Madeline Bray, she's in Nicholas Nickleby, Kate Nickleby, Little Nell from the Old Curiosity Shop, Agnes Wickfield and David Copperfield, Lucy Manette in Tale of Two Cities, all exist in the shadow cast by Mary Hogarth, if indeed she was capable of casting a shadow. Mary's death returned her to the allegorical innocence of childhood. While it's possible to multiply examples, I'd like to briefly recount that Rose Maylie, if you could advance the slide, please. Rose Maylie, who is eventually revealed to be Oliver Twist's aunt, is described as being in the lovely bloom and springtime of womanhood, at the age when, if ever angels be for God's good purposes enthroned in mortal forms, they may be without impiety supposed to abide in such as her. Rose first appears in the April 1838 installment of Oliver Twist. She is 17 and described as being exquisite, mild and gentle, pure and beautiful, full of sweetness and good humor. Earth seemed not her element. In the novel, she becomes seriously ill, almost to the point of death, but Dickens was able to do with Rose Maylie in his art what he was not able to do with Mary Hogarth in his life, rescue her from death. When almost 4 years later, Dickens was writing The Old Curiosity Shop and working on the scene of Little Nell's death, he imaginatively revisited the death of Mary, writing to Forster, I am the wretchedest of the wretched. It casts the most horrible shadow upon me, and it is much as I can do to keep moving at all. Dear Mary died yesterday when I think of this sad story. Next slide, please. Now let's turn back to Charles and his wife, Catherine. They married in April of 1836, and of course at this time, neither knew that Dickens would become one of the most famous authors in the English-speaking world. Reading back into their relationship, we sense that Dickens with his wife, Catherine, was never quite as happy as he had been with both Catherine and Mary. In fact, his devotion to the memory of Mary made him become increasingly irritated by his wife, and over time, his marriage became a domestic relationship without sympathy or affection. Catherine was placid, unoriginal, and pedestrian, while her husband was brilliant, ambitious, and pathologically restless, and she never understood Dickens' obsession with his work. The word incompatible seems entirely appropriate here. In later years, Catherine had fits of nervousness and episodes of postpartum depression. Over a period of 20 years, she bore 10 children and had a miscarriage, and Dickens became increasingly tense and dissatisfied in his marriage. In 1857, Dickens wrote to John Forster, "Poor Catherine and I are not made for each other, and there is no help for it. It is not only that she makes me uneasy and unhappy, but that I make her so too. She is exactly what you know in the way of being amiable and complying, but we are strangely ill assorted for the bond there is between us. Nothing on earth could make her understand me or suit us to each other. Her temperament will not go with mine. It mattered not so much when we had only ourselves to consider, but reasons have been growing since, which made it all but hopeless that we should even try to struggle on. What is now befalling me has been steadily coming ever since the days you remember when Mary, that is his daughter, Mamie, was born. This was 1838, 1 year after the death of Mary Hogarth, and 19 years before he was writing this letter. I know too well that you cannot, and no one can, help me." In May of 1858, after 22 years of marriage, Charles and Catherine finally separated. A separation agreement was negotiated, and Dickens settled on Catherine an annual allowance of £600. By mid-July, she had moved out of the home they shared, and she was established in a house in Gloucester Terrace near Regent Park. Owing to the separation, the potential for scandal was enormous, because breaking up a home and putting aside a wife, especially by someone with a reputation for celebrating domestic virtue and tranquility, was rarely done in Victorian times, and Dickens did not want to alienate a public to which he felt a palpable connection. But he became increasingly and aggressively self-righteous in defending himself. In a letter to the philanthropist Angela Burdett Coutts at this time, he wrote, "I believe that no two people were ever created with such an impossibility of interest, sympathy, confidence, sentiment, tender union of any kind between them as there is between my wife and me. It is an immense misfortune to her. It is an immense misfortune to me. But nature has put an insurmountable barrier between us, which never in this world can be thrown down." Dickens began to pressure friends to take his side and worked aggressively to control the narrative. He desperately wanted his statements to become the official version of events. Things came to a head in June of 1858, when Dickens went very public with the news of his separation. He published a personal manifesto on the front page of Household Words, a journal he edited. Ironically, in his frantic attempts to justify the deterioration of his relationship with Catherine and to assert his innocence in the matter, Dickens actually drew more attention and more suspicion to his marital situation. Here's a part of that statement from Household Words. "Some domestic trouble of mine of long standing has lately been brought to an arrangement involving no anger or ill will of any kind. By some means arising out of wickedness or out of folly, this trouble has been made the occasion of misrepresentations, most grossly false, most monstrous, and most cruel, involving not only me, but innocent persons dear to my heart. I most solemnly declare that all the lately whispered rumors touching the trouble at which I have glanced are abominably false, and that whosoever repeats one of them after this denial will lie as willfully and as foully as it is possible for any false witness to lie before heaven and earth." Dickens also wrote a letter and allowed his manager, Arthur Smith, to publish it in the New York Tribune and also in English newspapers in August, 2 months after the separation statement. In it, Dickens addresses what he calls this domestic trouble of mine, and the claims he made here are even more outrageous and defensively self-justifying than the statement published in Household Words. In this letter, Dickens asserted that "Mrs. Dickens and I have lived unhappily together for many years. Hardly anyone who has known us intimately can fail to have known that we are, in all respects of character and temperament, wonderfully unsuited to each other. I suppose that no two people were ever joined together who had a greater difficulty in understanding one another, who had less in common." He further stated that nothing has, on many occasions, stood between us in a separation but Mrs. Dickens' sister, Georgina Hogarth. Next slide, please. This is Georgina, another of Dickens' sister-in-laws, the younger sister of Catherine. "From the age of 15, this is back to Dickens' statement here, this is Dickens speaking. From the age of 15, she has devoted herself to our home and our children. In the manly consideration toward Mrs. Dickens, which I owe to my wife, I will merely remark of her that some peculiarity of her character has thrown all the children on someone else, that is, on Dickens' sister-in-law, Georgina Hogarth. I do not know, and I cannot by any stretch of fancy imagine what would have become of them but for this aunt, who has grown up with them, to whom they are devoted, and who has sacrificed the best part of her youth and life to them. For some years past, Mrs. Dickens has been in the habit of representing to me that it would be better for her to go away and live apart, that the always increasing estrangement made a mental disorder under which she sometimes labors. More, that she felt herself unfit for the life she had to lead as my wife, and that she would be better far away. This document provides a fascinating glimpse into the psychology of Dickens' self-justification. The tone brims with self-righteousness, while the substance essentially accuses Catherine of child neglect, claiming falsely that she had no interest in her children, that she in fact did not love them. Catherine's sister, Georgina, had indeed been a kind of surrogate mother to Dickens' children, and she supported Dickens' version of the separation. Another false claim is that for several years, Catherine herself had asked for a separation. Finally, inaccurately and cruelly, he also states that Catherine had a mental disorder that prevented her from being both a good mother and an obedient wife. Although they never divorced, after the publication of this letter, Dickens never saw or spoke to Catherine again, a period of 12 years. Now, what brought about these public and private declarations of malaise, dissatisfaction, and disillusionment? What are the rumors surrounding an innocent person dear to my heart that Dickens alludes to in his statement in Household Words? Dickens had become resentful, frustrated, and enraged by gossip that he had a mistress. And how did these rumors begin? In August of 1857, three professional actresses, Frances Ternan and her daughters Maria and Ellen, known as Nellie, were engaged to perform, along with Dickens, an excellent amateur actor, in Wilkie Collins' melodrama, The Frozen Deep. Next slide, please. Dickens felt drawn to and eventually fell passionately in love with Nellie. He was 45 and she was 18. In the spring of 1858, a necklace Dickens had bought for Nellie was accidentally delivered to Catherine, and her suspicions and jealousy were aroused. Dickens loudly proclaimed his innocence, and to humiliate Catherine, he insisted that she pay a social call on Nellie and her mother. Dickens' mother-in-law and his sister-in-law Helen spread rumors that Nellie was his mistress, and he forced a public retraction from them. But by October of 1858, Dickens had set up a residence for Nellie in London, and he began to lead a secret life that lasted 12 years until his death in 1870. Dickens scholar Anna Isba correctly states that the relationship was shrouded in secrecy, subterfuge, and cover-up, that Dickens exchanged a wife who did not share his life for a mistress who could not share it, if appearances of respectability were to be maintained. Reconstructing the relationship between Dickens and Nellie has been extremely difficult because the evidence that exists is ambiguous and is subject to much debate and argument. In attempting to reconstruct just one aspect of Dickens' relationship with Nellie, her whereabouts from 1861 to 1865, Claire Tomalin, who has written the most thorough and exhaustive study of this relationship in The Invisible Woman, says, "This is to be a chapter of guesses and conjectures, and those who don't like them are warned." But most modern scholars accept the following narrative. Nellie was Dickens' mistress for the last 12 years of his life. She became pregnant by Dickens, and he moved her to France to try to avoid scandal. She had her baby there, probably in 1862. The baby died, probably during the summer of 1863, and Nellie stayed on in France until June 1865, when she returned to England and was set up in a house in southeast London. So what kind of influence did this emotionally intense and illicit relationship between Charles and Nellie have on Dickens' later fiction? One consequence is that the women characters in his later fiction tend to become more complex and thus more interesting. We see this complexity in particular in Estella in Great Expectations. She's not an avatar of Mary Hogarth, an angel of the house, whose etherealized existence serves a symbolic function. Instead, she has suggestions of depth, and even of sexuality. She uses her beauty to lure men and is teasing, enchanting, and seductive. But the influence of Nellie Ternan in Dickens' later novels is not just evident in his women. Dickens also develops an interest in obsessive love on the part of his male characters. Pip's hopeless love for Estella is an obvious example here, but also Bradley Headstone's fixation on Lizzie Hexam in Our Mutual Friend, and John Jasper's consuming, disturbing passion for Rosa Budd in The Mystery of Edwin Drood. The love of these male protagonists borders on obsession, and many of them are racked by guilt and forced to lead double lives. In the last decade of Dickens' life, we see a slowdown in his literary production, but his output still includes such major works as A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend, and The Mystery of Edwin Drood. During the decade of the 1860s, Dickens instead devoted much of his energy to a series of public readings. And while this was enormously lucrative, it was also exhausting. In fact, his last series of public readings, scheduled for 1868 and 69, was canceled after Dickens collapsed. Could we have the next slide, please? On June 9th, 1870, Dickens died after suffering a stroke the evening before. He was in the middle of writing The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and two sources suggest that Nellie Ternan was at his side. She was left £1,000 in his will. While this is a substantial sum, it's a small percentage of Dickens' total worth and could be publicly perceived as merely a legacy to a family friend he cared about. As I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, the relationship of Dickens both to the women in his life and to the women in his fiction is complicated. Next slide, please. The fictional representations of women range from the etherealized perfection of his early heroines, Rose Maylie, Little Nell, Kate Nickleby, Agnes Wickfield, to the thorny complexity of Estella, Bella Wilfer, and Helena Landless. Throughout his life, Dickens tended to mine his personal experiences and transmute them in his novels. I'd like to give the last word here, not to Dickens, but to his daughter, Kate. In the 1920s, she was interviewed by her close friend Gladys Story for a book detailing Kate's relationship with her father. This book, Dickens and Daughter, was eventually published in 1939, 10 years after Kate's death. And while Kate's relationship to her father was emotionally convoluted, and even late in life she remained bitter towards him, she summed up her view with an admirable, though perhaps misplaced simplicity. My father never understood women. Well, thank you. That is ends the formal presentation. I'd be happy to get any questions you might have or responses you might have.
And at the beginning of the presentation, Sue had mentioned a couple of ways to ask questions. Many of you may have received Zoom training over the last few weeks. You can either raise your virtual hand using that blue icon, or putting your question in the chat box. Excuse me. And Sue, have you received any questions? While we were doing the presentation, I was not able to follow all the activity on the side.
No, I don't have any chat questions.
All right, well, it looks like we have Elizabeth with her hand up. I'm going to unmute Elizabeth. Go ahead.
I love Dickens, but I liked him better when I became an adult. When I was growing up, as many of the other people in this conversation have been, we studied Dickens, we did Great Expectations. And for some reason, I think that maybe Dickens is kind of wasted on teenagers, but by the time you're in the 20s, all of a sudden you realize how clever Dickens is. I think you taught in high school. What do you think?
Well, I think that any author and any relationship we have to a book can grow over time. So for example, I taught Macbeth for many years. I taught Great Expectations quite a bit as well. But in teaching Macbeth to, say, 16-year-olds, they have a certain level of understanding of Macbeth. I don't mean that in any condescending way. I mean, they have a 16-year-old understanding of Macbeth. But if they see the play when they're in their 20s or in their 30s or in their 40s, or read Great Expectations in their 40s and their 50s, it's a different experience because life experience has become much richer. But I don't think that's the reason for not teaching great books to adolescents, of course. It's just that, you know, you lead students through the works and try to reach a certain level of appreciation and understanding. But obviously it's different. The reading experience becomes more complex, as we know, as we grow older as well.
John, we do have a few questions from the chat. The chat, there's some running questions here. I'll go to the top. The first one comes from Sarah, and it says, do you think that Dickens might have suffered from bipolar depression?
Wow. Well, I'm no clinician, so it would be hard for me to say that, but he certainly was, he certainly was subject to bouts of depression and bouts of energy, shall we say, that may have bordered on the manic. I'm not sure I'm in a position to psychologically judge that, but he had a very complex character, very complex relationship with his children and with his wife. And imagine just being who he was as a very famous author. He couldn't have been easy to live with, whatever his psychological state. But I'm not aware of studies that can classify him in that clinical way.
Thank you, John. The next question comes from Marcia. Marcia asked, what was Dickens' relationship with his children?
Also complicated, especially when it came to his separation from his wife, because Dickens essentially forced his children to take sides. And some of his children accepted Dickens' versions of events and remained loyal to their father. Others remained loyal to their mother, and those he just cut off. He did not want to have anything to do with them. So again, I would back to the fact that he was a very difficult person to live with, created very strong emotions on all sides. But that was a particular dividing line in his life.
John, another question from Joel. I will ask the first part of it just to see if the answer is yes or no. Do you know of the film, The Invisible Woman?
Yes.
The second part of that question is that film accurate?
It's been a couple of years since I've seen it, so I don't have a real sharp recent memory of the film, but it is based on, I mentioned Claire Tomlin's very scholarly book called The Invisible Woman, which is a terrific literary sleuthing of Dickens' relationship with Nellie Ternan. And I guess the rights were bought to that scholarly book and turned into a commercial film, which might be a first. I haven't done an A-B comparison, but I imagine that Ray Fiennes, who stars as Dickens in it and also directed the film, based it fairly closely on Tomlin's book, so far as I remember. So I think it probably is fairly accurate.
I'm going to go, we've got a few more in chat, but I know Bev Appleton has been waiting with her hand up. I'm going to unmute you, Bev, and see if you can ask your question to John.
Actually, it's not a question, it's more of a comment. Since Willie Shakespeare and Charles Dickens were certainly soul brothers in English literature, I think it's worth mentioning that today is Mr. Shakespeare's 400 and something birthday. And Charles Dickens got very involved with saving Shakespeare's home back in the day, and he was a lover of Shakespeare's work. So I just want to share that.
Thank you. Dickens was also an excellent amateur actor and would do, I mean, it wasn't just minor little skits that he would do at home. I mean, he would rent theaters with friends, and they would put on major productions of plays by Wilkie Collins, a friend of Dickens, of Shakespeare, and you know, they would have large audiences for these. They were called amateur theatricals, but they were very professionally done.
Couple more questions here, John. Stephanie asked, how much of Dickens' characterization of women was, quote, a product of his time? And do his female characters differ much from those of his literary contemporaries?
I think that's a great question and a fairly complicated one. But it's certainly true that Dickens' personal experiences, especially I'm thinking of the death of Mary Hogarth, that led to this idealization of women characters in his books, that certainly fit in with cultural expectations of the time as well. In fact, in 1854, I think it was, Coventry Patmore wrote a poem called The Angel of the House, which presents a certain kind of Victorian ideal for women, at least from a male perspective. And there was a lot of reinforcement in that cultural pattern that Dickens had already experienced and established prior to that through his relationship with his sister-in-law. I think that in other 19th century English novels, there are women who are more complex and more fully psychologically developed than the ones that Dickens does. I mean, I think of Emily Bronte, certainly George Eliot comes to mind in Middlemarch, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. If I were to look for the most interesting women, Jane Austen, Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, look for the most interesting characters in 19th century English novels. I don't think I would go to Dickens as much as I would go to some of the other novels who were female.
John, another question comes from Betty. Do you know what happened to Dickens' mistress after he died?
Eventually, that's a good story, and it's not in the top of my mind, but eventually she married, and I think when she told her husband that she'd been Dickens' mistress, there was quite a blow up at that time. Her husband couldn't quite handle that knowledge. She became, through her husband, I think she maybe was the mother of 2 children, something like that. As I mentioned, the speculation is that she did have a child by Dickens, but the child died in infancy. And I don't believe that the movie of The Invisible Woman goes into that, but I could stand to be corrected about that. I just am not sure of the details.
John, I'm quickly reviewing the chat window, making sure that I've answered all of those questions. I don't see anyone's hand up at the moment, but I'm just going to pause for a minute just in case someone hasn't had a chance to type that in or would like to be called upon so we can unmute their mic. Well, John, I want to thank you and everyone connected. I am going to give you a little bit more instruction once I wrap things up. So do stay in the meeting just for a moment.
Okay.
But John, I do appreciate you volunteering your time today. All of the work that's gone into preparing your presentation and going through the run through and making sure everything works. I know the technology is new to a lot of us, and sometimes we have to learn new ways even after we've done it 1 or 2 times. And this has been different today, but it worked well. And everyone listening, we invite you back next week. We have a couple of presentations that we're going to be providing, one of which will be by Dr. Dana Henry, who is a professor here at JMU. and she'll be talking about sexual health for older adults. I think we're going to try to get a second lecture in next week as well. That will be announced by email. But I do hope you come back, and today and until then, I hope you remain safe and you remain well, and it's good seeing you all. I'm going to stop the recording, and then I'll give you one more instruction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.